I usually am on the stage with just Alex, and so this is a great treat to be here with both of them. The three of us have been colleagues for 12 years at least, you two longer. Here's their book. You're here to talk about This Will Not Pass, and so I want to dive right in because I'm sure you all have a lot of questions too. It's a phenomenal book. It is a book that spans one of the most consequential periods in U.S. history. You approach it from the view from Republicans, from the view of governors, the view of members of Congress, senators, and it encapsulates the past president, the current president. Tell me a little bit first about the process of writing this book. You two have shared a number of bylines over the years. How was this different? How did you approach it? I'm going to start with Alex and then move this way.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you so much, Maggie, for being here with us today. And thank you to the Y for hosting us to debut our book. And thanks to, of course, all of you. Look, this was a different project than we'd ever taken on before. It's my first book, it's Jonathan's first book, and it's just a project on a different scale than anything either of us had tried to get our arms around before. And I do want to just say that our great editors at Simon & Schuster, some of whom are here in the audience tonight, were extraordinarily patient with us in that process. But look, when we started out, we thought we're in the middle of a presidential election. Seems like it's going to be a pretty big one, and somebody should tell this story and tell this story right. And when, Jonathan and I have talked about doing a book on and off for some time, but once we started getting rolling, it was pretty clear to us that a campaign book was not going to get the job done. You had a once-in-a-century public health and economic crisis. You had, certainly by the time you get to the fall, all the warning signs are there that the outgoing president, is going to challenge and attack the transfer of power. And so if we had tried to end this narrative with the outcome of the election, which is what you do in a traditional campaign book, that was just not going to work. Right. In so many ways, the least interesting question of the last 2 years is who won the 2020 election. That is, unless you are really, really determined to keep a question mark on top of that one, is really a pretty overdetermined.
And we also knew that our readers wanted something more than the, there was a staff conference call and they got into a bitter argument about, do we spend more money in Columbus, Ohio or Tampa, Florida? I mean, that seemed like not the stuff of our time. It's like those questions seemed less consequential than the larger issues of American democracy. And also, campaign books typically end with the campaign ending, and the campaign never really ended in this case.
I think you can actually make the argument that the campaign has been going on since 2016, right? Yes. And that's maybe a different panel for a different time. The reporting begins with January 6th, and there's an extensive amount of it. Jonathan, I know you've talked about this elsewhere, but there's just incredible scenes that you were present for.
Yeah.
Talk to us a bit about what you saw that day.
Well, that's the other issue of why we decided to go bigger than just a sort of campaign book, is because after the 6th, it was clear that we were living through an historic moment that was going to be significant for future scholars. And I don't say that lightly. I mean, I think when we were reporting and writing this book, we were, doing so with the idea that we're offering kind of the building blocks for future historians looking back on this moment and trying to figure out what the heck happened in that period in American politics. So I was in the Senate gallery on January 6th, and that's basically sort of movie theater style balcony, 6 rows overlooking the Senate floor, and the Senate was evacuated when I was there, and thankfully, the Capitol police officers evacuating the senators, and by the way, all 100 were on the floor, which is pretty rare because, of course, they were that day voting to ratify the Electoral College.
What were you
The Capitol Police looked up and said, go to the basement.
But what was your mindset as that day began? Just tell us a little bit about, as you entered that building, we all had been watching these machinations for weeks. What was going through your head?
I mean, the big story going into that day was the previous day's events, because remember the 2 Georgia runoffs were on January 5th, and so for political reporters, that was everything that we were covering and sort of focused on. And then, of course, the 6th was going to come, and we were going to know who controlled power in the Senate, and of course, the Congress was going to ratify the Electoral College, because that's what happens in America. We just take that for granted. And that's a lesson in this book, is that you can't take that for granted. So long story short, I was evacuated to one of the Senate office buildings through the tunnels underground between the Capitol itself and the office buildings, and I just happened to be with the senators for a few hours that day while we were trying to figure out what was going on.
Can you talk a little bit about, and then I want to move back to COVID, but
sure.
Can you talk a little bit about specifically what you witnessed, senators scurrying in and out? And again, you talk about this in the book. Lindsey Graham is a very prominent figure in this book, a Trump somewhat tortured relationship ally over the course of 4 years. Describe what you witnessed that day.
So two memorable moments. One is when I got to the massive sort of hangar-sized conference room, and you guys have seen this because this is where the Iran-Contra hearings were held. Supreme Court hearings are often held there. The first thing was Mitt Romney summons me over, and I had covered his campaigns for president, and so I know him, and he summons me over and sort of looks me in the eye, and he says, he was responsible for this, and then he's spitting out his words, talking about how Trump bears blame for what had happened. It was the angriest I'd ever seen Mitt Romney in my life. And the other memorable moment was spending time with Lindsey Graham, who was wrestling in real time with the sort of compromise he had made with Trump the last 4 years, trying to game out how this was going to affect both Trump and the incoming president, Joe Biden, and also was trying to figure out how are we going to get back control of the Capitol. And at one point, the Capitol Police were speaking to the senators, and they don't really have a great sense for what's happening. They're trying to figure out if the Capitol is now safe again, and they're giving this briefing with not a lot of information. And Graham interrupts the Capitol Police officer and says, "You guys need to take control of the building. Take back, this is the seat of government. Use whatever force you have to use." And there's audible groans in the back of the room. And Sherrod Brown from Ohio says, "Shut up, Lindsey," which was quite a moment. So Romney and Graham sort of stick out from that day.
Thank you for that. Alex, you and just processing. You and I were on a Times panel at the very beginning of the pandemic, and I remember that we all got asked to make a prediction of what was to come related to the pandemic, and the question you got asked was, will there be political conventions? Is your big question, and of course that was the prescient one. There weren't. You guys captured the degree to which the pandemic changed absolutely everything in this year of the 2020 campaign. You also capture how Trump was dealing with it. One thing that I was struck by is some of the reporting that you had about Trump's conversations with governors, particularly blue state governors, who needed help, who needed federal assistance in the middle of this once-in-a-generation crisis. And I think that for those of us who lived in the sensory deprivation tank of that White House for a very long time, a lot of stuff became background noise. And I think one thing you guys capture so well is stuff that just shouldn't be normalized. So I'm hoping you can talk a bit about these conversations that Trump was having with governors.
Sure. I do want to say, I don't think it's that, certainly for a journalist like you, I don't think it's that something like this was normalized, that he was behaving like this, but I think there was an awful lot to cover in that time.
Yes.
And the way Trump was behaving towards federal agencies, towards foreign governments, was so wildly outside the boundary lines of what we consider acceptable for a president. I think that also describes the way he behaved towards a number of governors, and it was really, really striking. And actually, I think one of the things that we have tried to do in this book, and it was certainly part of the reporting process for us, was for people who think they know the story already, provide material that will still make you kind of sit up and say, oh my God, I can't believe that man did that. And I'm not talking about like throwing a Diet Coke at a staff member or something like that, just sort of the cartoonish Looney Tunes dimension to President Trump. But we spoke to a number of governors, predominantly Democrats, but though not entirely Democrats, about moments when they were seeking help from his administration. And one of them, the governor of Connecticut, told us that he felt like in one of the calls he had that he felt like President Zelensky, this was prior to the war obviously, but that he was seeking help with natural disaster assistance from Trump, and he had written into the administration asking for federal funding, extra federal funding to be approved, it was just not coming through. And he was told from the White House one day, expect a call from the president tonight. And so Ned Lamont is sitting in his, I don't know if he literally said he was sitting in his library. I pictured him sitting in a library. And he said he was sitting there with a glass of wine. He'd kind of finished his first glass of wine. He was thinking, should I have a second glass of wine?
Soft music playing. Yeah.
Right. And the phone rings, and it's President Trump. And he says, listen, I understand that you need some help. And Lamont says, yes, I do. And Trump says, well, ask me nicely. And it's basically a demand to grovel. And Lamont, a couple other governors told us similar stories. Larry Hogan, the Republican governor of Maryland, said that he got a similar, if you want stuff from me, you're going to need to ask me nicely. It's an instruction to grovel. And these governors, in this moment, these are people who run American states. They're not small characters in their own lives and in the lives of the country. And in the moment, of course, they oblige, because what choice do they have? They need to get help to their people.
Mm-hmm. And that's, I think, a moment that we all saw play out over and over again in various ways, because people in the moment, as you say, have to make these choices.
There was one other governor that I do just want to highlight, Roy Cooper in North Carolina. This was a slightly different situation, but because you mentioned the political conventions, the convention was supposed to be held in Charlotte. Yep. The governor, who's a Democrat, thought that would not be responsible in the middle of the pandemic, and President Trump wanted to go ahead with it anyway. He calls Cooper, and he doesn't sort of do quite the same heavy-handed shtick, but he does remind him on this call, Roy, we've done a lot of things for you in North Carolina. We've given you National Guard, given you ventilators, right? This is acting as though this is a bartering transaction. I've given you ventilators to save people's lives, and listen, we really got to go ahead with this convention.
Show me some appreciation.
Show me some love.
Well, something for the effort. Right?
Reciprocity is the word.
Yeah, reciprocity.
Reciprocity, that's a chapter name. You have an impressive, no, literally it's a chapter name by the book. You have an impressive array of elected officials, members of Congress, governors, going on record, mostly about their interactions with Trump and Biden. There were some places where sources and subjects appeared hesitant to have their names attached to certain things. Can you give this audience some insight into your reporting? What were areas, obviously without naming anything sensitive, but just what were areas where sources were sensitive about being identified? What were general topics or places?
I think any time with Democrats or Republicans that you're getting into private conversations, A, or B, criticism of their own colleagues and fellow partisans, I think those are sort of two areas where inevitably you're gonna run into some resistance, or at least reluctance. I will say though, we talked about this at great length, and it was remarkable to see it play out. When you're talking to political actors, members of Congress, governors, what have you, and you tell them, hey, that this is not gonna be in the paper tomorrow, next week, or next month. You're talking for history, so be as candid as you can be, and don't worry about it. And that was pretty effective, actually. I think people, when they know that they're talking for posterity, it compels them to be somewhat more candid and insightful. And so I think that paid off. I also think, we cast a really wide net. We put this in the acknowledgments section. One of the things we pride ourselves on is our effort to really sort of burrow into places, not just in Washington, but certainly in Washington, but beyond Washington, where you can find people that have information, but that maybe haven't been touched by other reporters. And so I think we spent a lot of time reporting this book, and that was really the focus, was just let's do the maximum reporting that we can, and we'll figure out the narrative later. And but up front, though, we just threw everything at reporting and scheduled as many interviews as we could.
I want to spend a little more time on the Republicans,
sure,
and then we'll move to the Democrats. There's been a wee bit of attention on your reporting around Kevin McCarthy.
Have you all heard?
But I think there's a tape. In many ways, McConnell is actually a more central figure in your book. Why is that? Can you talk a little bit about the role that he played during the Trump presidency, frankly, the role that he's played in the last year and a half, and what was interesting to you about both of these characters, McCarthy and McConnell, who are the two Republican leaders. They're obviously very different men, and they come off very differently in the book. I'm hoping both of you can address those.
We should, at this point, also, by the way, mention that Maggie has a book coming out this fall, and it's going to have a lot of
Not even 8
information.
p.m. He is good.
And,
Thank you.
And I hope you all will pre-order because it's available now on Amazon. Alex, go ahead.
Sure. Look, I think that one of the challenges, different challenge for those two characters, right? One of them is that McConnell is somebody who I think most readers feel like they know everything they need to know about. And Kevin McCarthy is somebody who I think most readers don't know anything about. And frankly, kind of deservedly so. One of them is one of the gigantic legislative figures of our or any time. And the other one is a guy who frankly has never really had actual legislative power and is mostly sort of a political tactician up to this point. And I think what we saw with the two of them is these two leaders in their own party subjected to this unbelievable political stress test and just acid test of their own characters. We see this obviously over and over again during the Trump years, but this is, different. It's not that they've never been confronted with a real moral quandary about how to interact with Donald Trump before, but we see them in the weeks after January 6th. The seat of American government has been attacked on the instructions of the president. They have both had their own lives in danger. They've both been evacuated to a military base to save their lives. And we see them wrestle with that in really different ways. And I think the thing that's so interesting, one of the things that's so interesting about the two of them is that there's a brief period of time where they're basically on the same page. And they agree this was totally unacceptable, this cannot stand, and we've got to do something about it. And both of them ultimately row back to Donald Trump, but at different paces and in different ways. And I think without sort of getting into the really, really deep reporting for the book, I think you see the difference between, two guys, one of whom is much more committed to Congress as an institution, the other one who is a younger man with a longer career and more lust for power, but ultimately both of whom are driven more by electoral political considerations than that moral outrage immediately after the attack.
You make me think of one thing, and I'd actually like both of you to address this. This came up when I interviewed a pair of our former colleagues from Politico, Jake Sherman and Anna Palmer, who wrote a book about Congress in the era of Trump several years ago. And the question was basically just about McConnell and McConnell's pure desire to win. McCarthy, you're describing as a version of that, a sort of lesser version of that, and less sophisticated version of it. There is a biting description of McCarthy in the book that I encourage you all.
Just one?
Well, there's one in particular about eyes pressed to the glass that I'm thinking about. But describe how, if you can, in what way those two men and Donald Trump are part of a spectrum of people for whom power is the ultimate goal.
That's a great question.
And how they all handle it. Because at the end of the day, that is sort of what we're talking about, right?
Alex mentioned something I think is worth contemplating for a second because it doesn't get enough attention. But when you say it out loud, it is sobering. The legislative leaders of the American government were evacuated to a military base to secure their lives against a mob attacking the U.S. Capitol. That's extraordinary that happened, and we just witnessed it happen. So Maggie touches on a really important thing, is how McCarthy and McConnell reconcile the accommodations that they're making to Trump. And this is an important distinction, and we mentioned this in the book. McCarthy totally is fine with it, okay? He famously is picking out Trump's famous Starburst, sending Trump those candies that he likes. He is taking pictures of himself on Air Force One and at Mar-a-Lago and posting them on Instagram with thumbs up. He cannot get enough of the trappings of the presidency, and it bothers him not at all that Donald Trump, this sort of obviously controversial figure, is the president, because here he is. It's me, Kevin McCarthy from Bakersfield, California. I'm on Air Force One, and you can't underestimate the tug of that. McCarthy comes to Congress at the very end of Bush's term. So all McCarthy has known in Congress is a Democratic president. He ain't flying Air Force One with Barack Obama. And so all of a sudden, here he is, and it's compelling and it's alluring. McConnell, I think, has a harder time reconciling, at least at some level. Look, he enables Trump. He turns a blind eye to every Trump outrage and breaking of sort of ethics. And he uses Trump. He gets 3 Supreme Court justices, a big tax cut. but he doesn't necessarily like it, at least at some level. He's not going in Air Force One. He ain't going to Mar-a-Lago for sure. And I don't think Mitch McConnell would know how to post a picture on Instagram necessarily. For him, it's business, okay? And it's operational. I'm going to use this guy to maximize my power and then try to ensure a center-right future for America. And the fact that he's a sort of odious character in McConnell's mind, I can deal with that. I'm just not going to celebrate it like McCarthy is. And those distinctions matter given where everything landed? Perhaps not, but it's an important nuance.
And just to bring Trump into it, as you sort of alluded to in the question, look, I think one of the distinctions that Jonathan is drawing out here is the distinction between a man who loved the trappings of power and the status and the title, and a man who loves power, right? And Donald Trump's interest in exercising the levers of government in a sophisticated way to produce certain outcomes is obviously limited. And Kevin McCarthy has never fully been tested. What will he do when he has actual power? But we know that he's willing to make extraordinary concessions and bargain away a lot of his own power in order to get a certain title. Mitch McConnell isn't interested in celebrity. He is interested in the title of Senate Majority Leader because he wants the power. And just to paraphrase Game of Thrones here, right, it's the difference between people who think title is power and people who understand that power is power.
Well, McConnell, I would also just point out, and I think you would both agree with this, I mean, McConnell, yes, he wants power. He actually does exactly what Donald Trump doesn't do, which is that he has legislative ends that he wants to see, and he has a vision of government. And it's one I suspect most people in this room don't agree with, but it is actually a vision of government, and Donald Trump does not have that at all.
And by the way, also more so than Kevin McCarthy, who I think has less of an ideology.
That's what I'm, no, I think that's right.
McCarthy and Trump are much more similar in terms of there's no real theory of the case in terms of an ideological agenda. Yeah.
I would like to switch to the Democrats. Your subtitle mentions both Trump and Biden. The book is split roughly between the last 9 months, roughly, of the Trump presidency, the first of Biden's. Describe a bit, before we turn to the meat of the Biden reporting, but what were the differences between reporting on Trump's world and Biden's world? There might have been a few.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there were a couple differences, but look, I think in terms of just the reporting challenge and the challenge in terms of thinking about how to tell this story. With Trump, you have a character who people think they know everything they already need to know, and you need to figure out how do you tell them things about this man that aren't necessarily going to change their mind about him, but that are going to tell them something new about him. And with Biden, really strangely, actually, given that he's been a major political figure for most of half a century in this country, I think that he was more of a blank slate. During the campaign, the whole Biden in the basement thing obviously was a thing that really happened. I think the American people didn't have a deep sense of who he was, or even particularly what he wanted to do as president. It's a scene that we have in the book in the summer of 2020 when Joe Biden's reviewing his options for vice president. His campaign does a whole lot of polling about the possible running mates and about him. And he turns to an advisor reviewing this polling and says, gosh, voters don't know me, don't know as much about me as I would have thought. And I think that sort of remains true today, that he is for all his familiarity as this sort of avuncular elder statesman who's been in the backdrop of our lives for a long time, I don't think people feel like they know a whole lot about Biden. But the trick is making him interesting, which is never a challenge with Trump. And so that was really what we drilled down, is how do you tell people something about Joe Biden that they actually want to know, and that isn't just the sort of Obama bromance shtick, or the sort of very familiar and serious and important stories about his family that again are very, very well known.
We were puzzled to hear this idea that is sort of pretty common in Washington, Maggie, that there's no leaks out of the Biden White House. You can't crack this crowd. Everything's buttoned up there. It's so different from Trump. We actually found it. I wouldn't say easy. It took a hell of a lot of work, but we have an extraordinary amount of reporting about who Joe Biden is, how he gets along with his advisors, with Congress, the sort of fault lines in his own White House, certainly the fault lines in Congress, and between the White House and Congress.
And within the White House? The president and the vice president?
Absolutely. And but it is puzzling, though, because the three of us have known for years that the Biden-Obama relationship in reality isn't that close. And that a lot of that is artifice. But this is new for a lot of people. And we get this pushback about how can you say that Biden and Obama aren't necessarily close? They're like brothers. Don't take our word for it. Biden's own book that he wrote after he left the White House. I'm committing the sin of plugging somebody else's book at my own book event. I can't believe it. But I'm in a generous mood. But Biden's own book talks about at length how frustrated he was at Obama and Obama's inner circle for nudging him away from running for president in 2016. Yes. He never forgot that. And we have a scene in the book which Biden clearly, those feelings are never far from the surface. And in the spring of 21, when it seems like Biden is riding high and he's going to get some historic legislation passed, Biden says to an advisor, I don't think Barack would like at all the idea of my agenda being bigger than his. So there's this sibling rivalry there between those two that is barely beneath the surface. And when Obama came back to the White House a couple of weeks ago, he called him Vice President Biden. Yes. That was not received well in the Biden White House at all.
No, and in fact, there was a very memorable shot of reporters and aides, and maybe not reporters, aides surrounding Obama, and Biden kind of drifting away.
With nobody following him.
Yeah. Not that anyone remembers these things.
Besides Joe Biden.
Alex, you talked about, to that point, Alex, you talked about, how there is actually material and ways to make people learn new things about Biden and trying to animate him and make the material interesting. Book's second chapter is an extremely rich and detailed description of Biden's vice presidential selection. I'm assuming part of your thinking going deep on that was that the choice presented the first test of him as the head of this party. Would tell us something about how he approached being the nominee and possibly president. What did we learn about Biden from that process and his ultimate pick of Kamala Harris, and some of the reporting that came out from the book a couple of weeks ago address this, but for this crowd, if you could talk about it. Sure. What did it tell us about Biden and his circle, and how well has that whole scene foreshadowed the way he's governed in the past 15 months, 16 months?
Yeah, I think in the same vein as trying to kind of puncture the myth of the Obama-Biden alliance, during the vice presidential search, it was kind of a truism to say that, of course, Biden takes the choice of a vice president more seriously than anybody else could, because he was vice president for 2 terms. He knows the seriousness and the gravity of the position. He knows his own age, right? He knows that his vice presidential choice is maybe weightier than someone else's. What we found in reporting this book was that it was an overwhelmingly short-term tactical decision. It wasn't a sort of visionary choice that, this is the next generation of leadership. This is the person who, if something happens to me or if I need to pass the baton in 24, I have the utmost confidence in Kamala Harris. It was a decision to say, I need to get through Election Day. We just need to win this thing. And in retrospect, I think it's fair for people to second guess that decision because, look, Biden may not run again in 24, and he is getting up there in years during a global pandemic. So was it a responsible choice if he didn't really have the utmost confidence in Kamala Harris, or if his advisors had real doubts about her? On the other hand, the rationale at the time was, we got to beat Donald Trump. Right. And if we don't beat Donald Trump, it doesn't really matter what happens in 21, 22, 23, 24. And that is one of the underlying, I don't want to say original sin of the Biden campaign, because I think that'd be an overstatement by quite a bit. But I do think that one of the features of the Biden campaign that has come back to haunt him in the presidency, original features.
Something the movie.
That has come back to haunt him in the presidency is approaching the campaign with the sense that we just got to do what we got to do in order to get to 270 electoral college votes. And if that means running as a centrist unifier, then we'll do that. And if it means running as a transformational FDR-style figure, then we'll do that too. In fact, we'll do it at the same time, and we'll sort out later which one of those are really going to be. And then it turns out that eventually that bill comes due.
You'd only write about Republicans in the Capitol, you write about Democrats, and we are in the home state of the Democratic Majority Leader. So I want to ask a parochial question. You have this great passage about a rebellion against Chuck Schumer's position in Senate leadership after the 2020 election. It derives from a sense among other Senate Democrats that their party had underperformed races that November, something we heard a lot about in those few weeks after Election Day until it was all obliterated by, talk about Dominion voting machines and so forth and so on. This was a fear that Schumer might have been too preoccupied on his own reelection and the threat of a primary challenge from AOC that he certainly spent a lot of time trying to ward off here to looking out for his members' interests. Tell us a little bit about how Schumer put down that rebellion and more generally how he's handled his national role and how he has juggled that with local politics.
I'll just address the immediate aftermath of the election and then turn it over to Jonathan. In the immediate aftermath of the election, two things saved Chuck Schumer from a more serious reckoning. He tries to just blaze past the dismal election results for Senate Democrats. There's a meeting right after Election Day where Jeanne Shaheen, the senator from New Hampshire, who is not exactly like a bomb thrower in the Senate caucus, stops the meeting and says, "Are we really not going to talk about what just happened in the election?" Schumer's response is basically, "We're not going to do that right now," right? And some of his colleagues come to him and say, "Look, this just didn't work. We lost a lot of races in tough states, but we also got a blown out in Maine, which is a state that Joe Biden carried. Like, this can't happen again." Schumer immediately makes a pretty, in the scheme of things, trivial concession, which is he's going to take a step back from micromanaging the Senate campaign committee. Not a huge concession, but a meaningful one because he's basically been operating it at this point for 14 years. And that sort of lets some of the, take some of the heat off of him. The other thing that happens is that Donald Trump detonates his own party in the Georgia Senate runoffs. And so the number of times that we spoke to people in November and December to say, are people not, why are people not angry at Chuck for how things went? And the response you'd get back would be like, well, they're waiting to see what happens in Georgia. And if Trump had not bailed him out there,
interesting,
or if the Democratic Senate candidates had been like slightly less effective than they had been in order to win those really, really narrow races, I actually don't think we quite know what would have happened to Chuck Schumer the day after.
Right, because think about it. So the Republicans take back the Senate in 2014, and Schumer fails to reclaim, well, I should say Democrats fail to reclaim the majority in 2016, in 2018, otherwise a great Democratic year. And then 2020, they fail again up until those two Senate runoffs in Georgia, which obviously go their way. But so Schumer has not had a great run here, and that's the context for the aftermath of Election Day when the Jeanne Shaheens of the world are just hair on fire, angry. Look, I think one of the things we pride ourselves on with this book is really illuminating the private reality. And separating the public portrayal, not just separating, casting it aside, and telling you, the reader, why the public portrayal isn't always right. In fact, often is not right. And certainly when it comes to Chuck Schumer, we have a ton of reporting about this. A lot of his colleagues, Democratic colleagues, are frustrated with him. Those who are more to his left believe he should be more assertive and try and stake out more progressive stances and sort of not tolerate cinema and Manchin the way he does. And a lot of his colleagues who are more moderates believe that Schumer's been much too consumed with his left flank because of the potential threat of a primary here in New York in 2022, when he's obviously up for a re-election. And those conversations happen in Washington every day about Chuck Schumer. And you just don't hear about it that often, but there's lots of it in the book.
The title of the book suggests that this political turbulence that we've all been experiencing is perhaps not gone. Talk a bit about what you see for the next couple of years in national politics, and then I do want to talk about a little bit about news of the day in terms of what's happening with Roe v. Wade.
Sure. Well, just really quickly on the title, I think that there was this, what seemed to us, and I know, Maggie, what seemed to you to be a real fantasy during the Trump years, that if only somebody could get rid of this unpleasant man, then the country could go back to what it was beforehand. And I think it's clear that that's not the case. If Donald Trump were to decide tomorrow that he was going to ride off into the sunset and move to a commune in Mountain West or something, that would be surprising. But I also think
Survivalist Trump.
Right, prepper. But I also think it's clear that the country itself and the political system is sicker in a deeper way than just this one guy. And it was one of the arguments that we covered in depth during the Democratic presidential primary in 2020. It was the argument of, is the problem here Trump? Is Trump the problem, or is Trump the symptom of the deeper problem? And I just think it's inescapably clear at this point that he is the symptom. He's a really big symptom, but he's a symptom. And so the Joe Biden fantasy that you beat this guy, Republicans will have an epiphany, we can get things back to some version of normalcy, it's just not going to happen.
It was hard to know when to stop reporting this story, in part because we both love reporting, and it was hard for us to put our pens down and our phones away. But it was also hard because the story is ongoing. And that's one of the challenges in writing contemporaneous history, is there was no obvious place to stop. And I would just, before we turn to present day's events, I would point out to you that there's a number of unanswered questions, the likes of which we have not had in this country for some time. The two most obvious ones being, does the incumbent president seek re-election? You know, in our lifetimes, that's always been a given, that a first-term president, of course, will seek re-election. It's not with the president who will turn 80 years old this November. What happens in the Democratic Party with Joe Biden in the next year and a half? On the other side, we have not had, at least since the 19th century, a former president come back and try to serve a second non-consecutive term, and we certainly have that with Donald Trump. So these are unusual times, to say the least. Before
we get to Roe, I want to posit both of you a hypothetical that I get asked a lot. And Alex, you made me think of it when you were talking about the wish casting, that if only someone would, I mean, that's kind of been the point of the last 6 years, right? Is people waiting for someone to get rid of Donald Trump. He will.
And it's always somebody else.
It's always somebody else.
Yeah.
It is always go. You know, this is an ongoing joke of Alex's and mine going back many years about looking for somebody else to solve a problem. But I do think that has been actually a pretty recurring theme, is that nobody wants to deal with the reality in front of them, which is part of why it's been so jarring for people to realize exactly what you said, that the political sickness in this country is much deeper than people realize. Is there, and this is a question that I've been asked a few times lately, and I know my thought, but I'm curious both of yours, was there possibly a moment in 2016, probably would have had to be 2015, but had enough Republicans, enough prominent Republicans repeatedly stood shoulder to shoulder, and, you know, Paul Ryan, Mitch McConnell, several governors,
George W. Bush,
and openly said all of the things that, as we've discussed, they all say in private, or many of them say in private, and said this publicly, would it even have mattered? Were they acceptable enough messengers to have made a difference? Personally, I'm not sure, but I'm just curious what you think.
I mean, I'll start. Look, I think the moment for that would have been when it may have been too late, Maggie, but the moment for that would have been, was Trump right there? Okay. Mr. President. Total fake news. The moment for that, I think, potentially too late, Maggie, that would have been in November of 15, when the soon-to-be nominee of a major party called for a ban on all Muslims that come to America, basically threatening to ban an entire religion from coming to a country that's based on immigrants. Look, I think that would have been a moment to try to stand up and say, this is not who we are, this is not tolerable. But I'm skeptical that it would have worked. And I think what you always heard in 15 and 16 about this topic was, if we do that, he'll just run third party and he'll siphon away votes and ensure a Democrat wins. Now look, I think that there's some justification to that concern, but it's also so self-serving to say, I couldn't have done it in hindsight, he would have just left, run third party.
I mean, it's such, excuse me, it's a family audience, but it's such bullshit, right? And like when you look at the election that they just had in France, right? You had a candidate from the extreme right advance to a runoff election, and you see virtually every other candidate who has not made it to the runoff, from the mainstream right to the political middle to almost up to the extreme left, close ranks behind the incumbent, who is a sort of center-left ideological chameleon. Right. And because they see it as a responsibility to do something about it when somebody who's they see as kind of fascist adjacent is at risk of becoming the president. So, you know, I think an interesting what if for 2016 is what if Joe Biden had run that year? And what if the Democrats had wound up with a nominee who was not such anathema to conservatives as Hillary Clinton? Would there have been more of a willingness to, not just sort of turn your back on Trump and not appear with him, but to actually actively campaign against him? But one of the things that we have seen so consistently from 2015 through January 6th to the present is a set of leaders on the Republican side who cannot imagine anything worse than losing an election. And if that's your attitude, then the option that you just presented basically doesn't exist.
And I would add one other caveat to that, which is that I think that what the three of us discovered during that year of reporting in 2015 and 2016 is that everything that had previously been disqualifying for any candidate just was out the window with Donald Trump. And while the rules don't totally apply to other candidates, they do more than they used to. Let's talk a little bit about what's happening with the Supreme Court right now. Just to both of you, Alex first, what do you see the impact of what seems to be likelihood that Roe v. Wade is going to go away?
I think the degree of the ruling is going to matter a lot. That if it's a ruling that essentially blows another hole in Roe and allows the 15-week ban to stand, but doesn't completely strike it down, then I'm not sure what the impact would be. I think if you completely gut Roe, like the draft opinion that was published by our former employer Politico.
And one of our amazing colleagues, Josh Gerstein, who I have to give a shout out.
Just an extraordinary,
Amazing.
once in a lifetime, once in a life of the Republic kind of scoop, right? If that's the opinion that ultimately gets voted on, then I think it's a real wild card in the midterm elections. I think it transforms the debate about social issues and women's rights in the country. And I think there's a band of voters who are, moderate women have been one of the most consistently influential swing groups in the country. And they don't particularly care for Joe Biden right now. They're upset about crime, they're upset about education, they're upset about inflation. But you know what they really, really don't like is a total ban on abortion with no exceptions.
And there's another group also that has not been hot on Joe Biden, that's younger voters. Biden's numbers have really taken a hit with younger voters who, when they don't have the Trump contrast, they don't like Joe Biden that much, it turns out. And I think it potentially could galvanize younger voters. I will just add one fast point. Speaking to somebody who's very active in these issues, a longtime progressive, this person expressed a deep concern, even if Roe was overturned, that Democrats don't have very effective messengers on the issue. Joe Biden has never really been a champion of abortion rights. He actually has been ambivalent about it for his entire life. And obviously Chuck Schumer is not going to be the one leading the charge out there, and it's not clear who will. And I think that could be an important test here. Can Democrats fully leverage the issue if they don't have a messenger out there speaking about it each day?
I'm going to turn to audience questions. And this one I like because this is a book process question that we all get from time to time. What motivates your sources to speak to you?
Oh, that's a great question.
Such a great question.
We're just such nice guys.
I know. No, that's why I talk to you. Why do your sources talk to you?
Yeah, we'll just have a nice conversation. Don't even think about that recorder over in the corner, and just tell us about your childhood. So look, I think it varies. I think some people talk because they like to be close to the action. They want to be in the game. They want to be players. I think some people talk because they feel as though it's important to clarify the record as to what happened and why it happened, and they don't want it being distorted, at least in their mind. And I think some people talk because it's not going to be in the paper. Look, I think we talk to some people who I'm skeptical would have said what they would ever say to us in our day jobs.
I can attest to that.
And Maggie book coming out this fall, pre-order tonight. So many conversations that I'm thinking about right now in my mind that the people were saying things. If they knew that was going to be in the paper the next day, oh my Lord, they wouldn't say. It's just so different.
I think just very, very quickly,
Please.
I do think that January 6th also opened up a lot of people to sharing their experiences because they felt in such an immediate way that the stakes were so high and they wanted it recorded for history in a really immediate way.
As well, actually, this is a continuation of what Jonathan just said, but I am curious if there was any approach to this at all in terms of how you decided what came out before the book was released. As journalists, how do you differentiate between what should be a news story and what should be a book? What made you decide to write this as a book? You addressed most of this earlier on, and not publish as individual stories in NYT. I do think that your point that most people would not have said things like this for the paper. I mean, I can point to probably 20 sources in your book who would not have said such things for a news story.
Yeah, I think people are more candid when they know they're speaking for history. And I make one more point too, and that is reporting is not the sort of stuff of Hollywood fantasy where something is given to you with a nice bow wrapped on it outside your door one day. It takes a lot of work, of blood, sweat, and tears. You know, Maggie is rarely seen without her phone in her hand because she's working so damn hard around the clock. This is not a business where it comes to you. You got to go to it. And so I would just say that because it takes weeks and months and sometimes even years to nail down a story and to get the fullest version of the story that you can.
This will be tough for both of you to answer, but I think it's adjacent to what we've been talking about. If we allow politicians to commit serious crimes, particularly those against the state, aren't we inviting authoritarian rule? I think the question there becomes who the definition of we is.
Right.
But I do think this is a question we have, as journalists, have been asked a lot. I'll frame it another way. Has the last 6-year period so exposed the limitations of institutions in this country that it raises questions about how effective any of the existing ones are?
So, I mean, I actually love this question. To me, the specter of authoritarian rule, obviously not something to dismiss out of hand, but I think that one of the lessons of the last 6 years is that the worst, it's not the worst case scenario, but the worst case realistic scenario is not sort of jackboots coming in the night to seize ballot boxes. It's just this slow degradation of institutions and the effectiveness of government and a sort of communal sense of ethics and shared ownership of the country. We have done a really poor job of holding our presidents accountable for their behavior for a really
going
long
back a while.
time.
Yep.
So I have been surprised the conversations that I've had over the last 6 years from people who will say this is the worst time I've lived through pre-COVID, because that was quite bad. But like people who lived through the assassinations of a president, the assassination of the country's most prominent moral leader on civil rights, the Vietnam War, right? This is stuff that degraded the American people's faith in their state before I was born and long before Donald Trump ever put his name on the ballot. So I'm not saying this to minimize the effect of the last few years, but I do think that one of the things that the last few years has done is draw our attention to how degraded our government already was and how vulnerable it would be to the wrong kind of person. When you look around the world, yes, there are democracies where the military seizes power, a strongman seizes power and demolishes the state, but far more often you have some, venal, unserious, unscrupulous, person who's often seen as a buffoon.
Win an
or a
election,
crook.
yeah.
Win an election, right? And then have a ball. And that's obviously pretty close to what we just experienced here.
Real fast, too, to respond to that lets voters off the hook.
Yes,
okay?
it does. Yes, it does.
And I think back to our paper, and if I had a dime for every time I've heard this criticism of our paper, in 2016, you guys didn't cover Donald Trump. If you go back 2016 and you look at the coverage of Donald Trump by our newspaper in 2015 and 2016, man, if you read that paper, your eyes were wide open about who Donald Trump was, about his personal ethics, about his business history.
And all three of our names were on many of those
Everything
stories.
you wanted to know, it was there in black and white.
Yep.
Folks, the American voter knew, they understood who Donald Trump was by and large by November of 2016. They made a decision, and I think it overstates the influence of the press to suggest that somehow if the American people only knew more about this household name celebrity who had been like renowned for years, so some would say infamous for years, they would have made a different choice.
It's actually another way of saying if only someone will rid us of this person, and the voters actually are perfectly capable of doing that. Another tough one, but I'm going to relate it. It's not a specific question. I'll I'll tell you what I think the scope is. Even with so much evidence of corruption against Trump, do you think this investigation will go nowhere like Mueller and impeachments? I assume this means the related January 6th investigations, the committee and DOJ, and now there's an impaneled special grand jury in Georgia. I'm covering January 6th part-time. You guys are not on that particular story, but what is your perspective, knowing Congress as you do, how do you think this is going to go?
You know, I'm not going to go out on that limb with how I think this is going to go. But what I will say, and just in reference to sort of my answer to the previous question, we've never indicted a former president in this country. We've never impeached and removed one from office, although Nixon, just sort of stayed one step ahead of the jailer. So if a grand jury somewhere returns an indictment, or if there's a criminal referral from the January 6th committee, it would be an earthquake in modern American history, and I'm not in the business of trying to parse out whether
wise
that's gonna
man.
happen.
Jay Mart, I assume you're going to take the fifth here
go to
too.
the next question. Yeah.
Who were the courageous journalists today?
Maggie Haberman.
That's thanks.
Maggie Haberman.
No, but really.
Full stop.
No, we love Maggie. Obviously, we're colleagues and friends, but no, it's been extraordinary to watch her work under the most trying of circumstances, outrageous attacks on her character and professionalism, and she has been a model for journalists across the world. And so we are honored to be her friend and colleague.
Oh my God.
I say that with total seriousness. And who else?
There are others.
No, look. I think. There have been a lot of our colleagues in TV and print who have done fantastic work over the last 5 years. And one of the challenges that we have is not just that the accusations of fake news and this and that, it's that people have so many sources now of information that it's hard to get their attention, and it's hard to sort of get them to focus on what really does matter. And I think, look, there was a lot to be said for an era where you had, some gatekeepers. There was a lot of downsides to that era too, but I think in that era you at least had some version of a shared reality that you don't necessarily have today.
100% true. This is the last question of the night. I want to thank you all so much for being here with us. And on a slightly more optimistic note, do you have hope for the country?
Sure.
Okay. What gives you hope?
Well, two things. One is this country's been through some pretty bad stuff in the past, right? And not to sound like President Biden here, but folks, America always comes back stronger than it was before.
Your word as a burns.
Right. I don't really believe it's true that America's always come back stronger. But we've been through world wars. We've been through a civil war. We've been through a pandemic before. We've been through segregation. We've been through slavery. And obviously those were some pretty unpleasant experiences for a lot of people and just morally scarring for the country. And I just don't believe that it's impossible to think that America is in a better place 10 years from now than it is today, because over the course of our history we usually are. The other thing is, and this is sort of an indistinct hope for the future, but one of the things that we can sort of look forward to the next few years is there's going to be an enormous generational change in our politics. That the figureheads of both parties are deep into their 70s. The Speaker of the House is in her 80s. The young man of Washington is Chuck Schumer, who is merely 71 or 72. And at some point, some of these people will decide that they'd rather spend time with their grandkids or their real estate properties than continue running for office. And so it's not that I think the next generation will certainly be better off, because they might be just as bad or worse. But there is this moment of change coming. It's going to be a period of extraordinary political unpredictability. But anyone who feels like we are just locked into exactly this experience forever, that's obviously not true.
Jay Mart, last word?
I think that if you look at the generosity and the ingenuity and the empathy of Americans, it gives you so much hope for a better future. And if somehow we could find a way to sort of match the goodness and decency of the American people that we see illustrated so many times in moments of crisis with our politics, which are so lacking, I think that would mean the world. We talked about this, in the book. I don't think we put it in the acknowledgments when all was said and done, but certainly it's a conversation that we had, and that is, we just wish that the representatives, the elected officials in America, could better reflect the sort of goodness of the American people. And I think we'd be in a lot better shape if that was the case.
With that, thank you so much for coming tonight, all of you. Please buy this book. Thank you to the Y. Thank you, Alex and Jonathan. Good night.